Thank you very much. So, before I start, two things. One, possibly in homage to my boss, I've developed a slight cough this morning, so apologies for that. The second thing is, and I'll be honest with you, when I drafted this presentation, I didn't think about the size of the screen. So, please brace yourself for the next slide. This was not what I had in mind, and I do apologise. There we go. What I have noticed when I did the run-through is maybe a diet is required. I'm Matthew Sparks. I'm the Deputy Director at the Crown Commercial Service for the financial services category, which is approximately £3 billion of public sector spend. Now, it's probably worth saying, this is going to be relatively interactive, so you're going to have to pay attention for a start. Secondly, by a show of hands, and I won't delve into it, but how many of you have heard of the Crown Commercial Service? This is impressive, actually. Well done. Okay, that's probably about 40% of the audience. Well-educated people. So from my point of view, for those of you that don't know the Crown Commercial Service, it's a executive agency and trading fund of the Cabinet Office. I'm going to assume, as a result, you're not familiar with the Government's Trading Fund Act of 1973? No. Sadly, neither was I until I started this. It essentially means that the Crown Commercial Service derives at least, or has to derive at least 50% of its operating revenues from non-taxpayer sources. So the good news is, none of you guys are paying my salary. In fact, we derive 100% of it from non-taxpayer sources, so everyone's winning there. The Crown Commercial Service fundamentally has two key things: the provision of common goods and services to the public sector. So I want to be clear about what I mean by common goods and services, because one man's common isn't necessarily another's. If you think about it in terms of, we have a fleet services category that looks after vehicles, because naturally things like the police force need cars. We don't do battleships. And very specifically, we don't do battleships for three reasons. One, battleships are really tricky. Two, that's very much the province of the Ministry of Defence. And three, we don't argue with them because they're the ones with the guns. Terrible idea. So, common goods and services for the public sector. Now, yes, we're an executive agency of the Cabinet Office, but we don't just do central government and all of its many vast requirements. We also have the wider public sector: education, local authorities, health. And we also have the third sector as well, the not-for-profits, the charities, the housing associations. So I guess, as you can imagine, that's a pretty broad spectrum. And Nick talked about it earlier, there's a section of a bucket which banks will call SMEs, and with millions of customers in there, which plays to a small scale, but we've also got to worry about the Ministry of Defence and Doreen in Darlington Library, who just wants a POS terminal so she can take the book fines. And then we've got one-man band charities. It's a huge spectrum that we've got to deal with. So, the question you're now asking yourself is, what makes me qualified to stand here and talk about any of this at an acquiring conference, which, by the way, is going very well. Fourth one I've been to. Thought it was about time I did something. I spent last 2 years at Crown Commercial Service. Before that, I spent 10 years for my sins in the banking sector, predominantly through a series of generalist roles, looking at project management, program management, operational, contract, and eventually procurement of payment services, including, luckily for me, merchant acquiring, which is in part what got me the gig now. So, everyone ready for the next question? In the time it's taken me to briefly do this introduction, across the public sector, what have we receipted in the approximate, let's call it 4 minutes, that I've done an introduction for? Any guesses? Feel free to shout out. Wow, okay. Everyone enjoyed the Chancellor's budget the other week? So, was it £6 million? Government, or public sector, sorry, will take in £810 billion in the next tax year. £1.5 million a minute is what we get in. Now, I guess, to give you some scale around this, the entire UK card acquiring market in 2017 was only worth £600 billion. So we are larger, in terms of everything that we net in, we are larger than the entire UK market on its own, which gives us a certain amount of scale to come and play with. Now, when I joined CCS about 2 years ago, there had been a series of frameworks that were already in place, very much I guess, legacy frameworks, fundamentally very old school, very much focused on sole card acquiring. And it focused quite heavily on a very small group of suppliers, the kind of names you'd expect to see in there. But we also have a limited number of expert clients. So we're privileged to work with large organisations in government like the Government Banking Service, HMRC, DVLA and DVSA. Now those guys are expert clients. They have to because of the size and scale of the values they're taking in. However, Doreen in Darlington Library, God bless her, absolutely no idea about acquiring. So it's very, very hard for us to touch those people. And when I talk about the scale of it, if I take Crown as being one sole single entity, so everything that comes under central government. But if I look into the wider public sector, if I look into the third sector, we've got the best part of 500,000 entities that are entitled to use our services, so therefore servicing those needs is quite challenging, and even understanding them, let alone getting the right requirement. We can't expect everyone we work with to be an expert client. Therefore, realistically, we have to help them, and that's part of our role. Part of the challenge I also had was the team that was in place at the time, which has grown and developed in my tenure, thankfully, weren't necessarily entirely au fait with this market. They were very, very good on, ironically, the card issuance side, but not this side of the coin. So trying to develop, upskill, and promote what we were doing internally, and then being able to serve those people within that 500,000 bucket of customers that we fundamentally have was quite a challenge. Now, to give you some idea of scale, I talked about the 810 billion that we're going to take in next tax year as government. The reality is we take in through CCS, through what we do, less than 2% of that. So no, there's a relatively large prize we can go after there. And the reality is people use different things. So if you think of income tax, if you think of NI contributions, if you think of invariably your tax sticks for your car, there are lots of other ways to pay for it. Although I did move house the other week, and I was very, very pleased to find out that you can still send a cheque to the DVLA to change your address on your driving licence, which is fantastic. Didn't know that was still a thing. There are lots of ways, and predominantly electronic fund transfer, to be able to receipt into government. But this is where we want to try and change that and help government and the public sector at large try and influence the way they do it in a better, more valuable way for ultimately you guys as taxpayers. Now, I talked about part of the scale and challenge of this, being that at the central government end of the scale, you've got some very big consumers in DVLA, Government Banking Service, and HMRC. Their profile is very, very different to the other end of the scale. You've got an ATV with HMRC. We have a little game every year as to guess the highest £1 million plus card transaction to pay their corporate tax bill. It's quite a fun game. I won't tell you what it is, but it's phenomenally large. It's nearly maxing out a certain scheme's limit for a single transaction, which is good for us, I guess. But we are in quite a unique position in that we don't have a particularly high fraud profile, because realistically no one's trying to pay their tax bill on a bent card. Doesn't really make sense. Similarly, from a DVLA point of view, you're not trying to do that because it's very easy to find you. Weirdly, fishing licences through the Environments Agency, a little bit more of a problem. I presume you're harder to find on a riverbank. And of course, by virtue of some of these services, Home Office, UK Visa and Immigration, the nature of the card product is broader than Visa and MasterCard. You sit there with the JCBs, weirdly not many Amexes coming through for the people who are applying for those visas. So the scale of what they need is very different to, and I'll take the charity sector, the very much lower end where it's a very low ATV. A lot of it now is progressing towards contactless donations of a couple of £. And they are very, very much solely focused on Visa, on MasterCard. It is a fun challenge, I would say. I don't want to sound negative about any of this. It's an absolutely great challenge to be able to try and work with that scale. And actually, we've spent a number of months now working with PSE around how can we help better influence the sector, how can we get more players in the market to come and join us in what we're trying to do, and realistically, how do we get a proposition, a better value proposition for the taxpayer? And I should say, when I talk about value, I mean that holy blend of, holy trinity blend of service, cost, and risk. It's not purely about cost. This isn't a cost play. So things we want to look at. So in the short term, absolutely getting our house more in order, more fit for purpose. We are going to move away from what is fundamentally a classic card acquiring framework. We want to move out, and obviously the developments in both open banking and PSD2 over the last few years have enabled us to look more closely at maturing suppliers, albeit not mature, in the APM world and the PISP world. So curiously, Companies House is slightly further forward than most of government on this. Actually, if you really want to, you can pay your Companies House accounts each year through PayPal. It's an option. And being able to give the end user, be it us as a taxpayer, as a citizen, or be it us from a corporate capacity, the option of how we pay while still within that value bracket is absolutely the right thing to do, and that's what we should be doing. Progressing forward, we have what I call GovPay, but it's gov.uk Pay, which is fundamentally the central gateway for a lot of government acquiring services. So if I want to go and buy my fishing licence, it'll route it through that service. We also have a question to answer as to how we best get value out of that service. How do we continue to sweat that asset? And part of that could be, and I say these as options, I do not pitch them as a fait accompli, but part of that could be, how do we grow what's there, and how do we make it a central payments infrastructure for government? We're also in a huge time of change where what they call now Pay.UK, the new payment systems operator, is in place. They're pulling together their architecture. There is a question mark that we have in our mind in my team, which is, actually, what are we going to do? Do we actually need a market? Do we need the WorldPays et al. Of this to do some of this, or can we hook part of our architecture straight into theirs, Pay.UK, and leverage it that way? Be interesting to see how that market develops over time and see how we leverage that. Longer term, there is also a slightly separate question as to, do we actually become our own acquirer? Is that the right thing for government? Is that the best use of taxpayer money to do that? Can we get a better service, a more resilient, a more robust service by doing that? It's a really exciting time for me, and the work that the team are doing around this, to be able to look at what the future looks like. You know, I'm sure the vast majority of you won't need me to tell you that the payments landscape, especially in this country, is evolving wonderfully quickly and going in some beautiful directions at the moment. And we're really excited to see what it can do. So that's it for me.